The old farm. Now this will bring back a lot of memories for a lot of you. And some of you won't. Some of you won't like this either. But this is the way it was back in these old Appalachian mountains. And it still is today. But this was really a big thing back in the day. This is just to bring back memories in the history of these old farms. Now these old farms, they were self-sufficient back in their day. They depended on themselves and maybe their neighbors. But this was a way of life in these old mountains and these rural areas. That's the way it was. Now the first thing I'd like to say is I'm not here to argue about tobacco's good for you, tobacco's bad for you. We all know tobacco's bad for you. But for myself, what's the difference? Black lung, rock dust, cigarette smoke, it really doesn't matter. But I'm not here to argue none of that. I'm just here to tell a story of the history of these old mountains, like it or not. Now here, these are the top producers of tobacco states in the U.S. They come in here with this tobacco probably back when they settled this whole country in the colonies back in the early 1700s, and they started growing it on plantations and little farms. Now here's the top 7 tobacco producing states in the U.S. Right here they are. Now the top producers in the world is China. U.S. is only 5th in the list. And you remember back in the old days when everybody smoked a cigarette? They didn't know, didn't care. They went through all the world wars and all that stuff. And our elders, they loved pipe tobacco. They loved it. I could remember that growing up, the smell of it. And they loved that Prince Albert. That was their thing. If they wasn't growing their own, they'd have an old can of Prince Albert around the house. That was the thing back in them days. And it wasn't nothing you go out in the store back in the days before times changed that you'd see a cigarette machine about anywhere you went, with the candy machines and everything else, newspaper machines. This was just a way of life back in the day. But times have changed. Now they didn't just grow this tobacco just for self-use. They growed it to make a living on it too. This is how they paid their taxes and got them through to the next year, paying their workers if they had sharecroppers or whatever. But this was a big business back then. Now they had regulations on this they'd put on them in the 30s, all the way up to 2004, I think, on a quota on how much you could grow on each piece of land you had. But that went away. They still growing in every state, and it is a big thing. Now I'm going to share some pictures with you here of how they used to do it in the old days, and they still do it that way today. Now they started out with these little old, making these seedling beds for the tobacco. They usually started that out in March back in the day, and they still do today, and they kept them covered up. In about a month to 2 months, the seedlings would come up into plants being strong enough to where they could transplant them in the field. In the meantime, they would get their fields ready to plant it in. And when the time come to transplant, they'd get together with the family, the friends, or the workers, or sharecroppers, whoever they had, and they would set out transplanting these plants out of the seedling beds into the field. And they took a lot of pride in this too, because this is how they paid their taxes and got them through every year. This is a big cash crop for all this around the country, especially in the south and the rural areas of these mountains. And here's different ways of how they used to plant these in the fields. They had their own little designs. Here they got one sitting in seats as the horses pull them up and down the field, just planting them in the ground. Now, as time went on, it grows just like any other crop, and they watched over it. They would try to watch the bugs, didn't eat it up. It's like any other crop. watching it grow, hoping they have a good season on it. Now here's what they call priming. Usually the bottom leaves would mature early, and they would pick them off for early tobacco and let the rest of it wait till it cures. So the bottom would always cure out first. And they took a lot of pride in it back in them days, and they do today too. This is big money, tobacco. Look at the fields. Some places it's got hundreds, if not thousands, of acres in these big farms. But back then, it was a small business for a little old farm. They may have a couple acres or maybe 4 or 5 acres. But this is a big livelihood to these people back then. And when the time come in late August, usually, around the time, according on the weather and the season, they would go to cutting. And they would cut it and lay it out there and let it cure a little bit, dry out a little bit. And they had their own ways of doing it, their own tricks. Every farmer was different. How they'd stake them on a stick. I know this is hard work. I've done some of this as a young man. This is some hard, hot work. And a lot of you that have done this, you know what I'm talking about. They'd let them cure out in the field for a day or so, and then they'd stack them, and they'd take them to where they want to cure them at. A lot of work involved in this, but they paid people pretty good money to help with this. Now, some of them would haul it way off into their barns and cure them from the farm wherever they had their crop at. And some of them would cure them by the sun, just setting them out in the sun. But you're depending on the weather too. If you got a rainy spell, this wouldn't do you much good. But this is one way of curing it, by the sun. The most popular way is just air cure. They would just air cure it. That's putting it in barns and stuff in this heat and let it dry out slowly. Big old barns like this. They might have 2 or 3 barns, according to how big a crop they had. And they'd let them cure out in places like this. And it's a lot of work putting it in these barns too. If you had a lot of big crop, a big barn, you have to get up there and hang it everywhere. A lot of work involved in this. And yes, it was dangerous too in some places. You fall and break a leg or kill yourself. A lot of people got hurt doing this too. You had to be careful at what you're doing, hanging this back in these barns. Well, they'd let it cure for a month or 2, according on the weather, heat, and they would get it off the stalks and start grading it a little bit and getting it ready to take to the auctioneer. And that was usually in the late year of about November, according on the time of year, wherever it's at. They'd take it to these big auction barns and prepare it so these tobacco company representatives would come around and purchase it, hoping they get a good price. And they would go around looking at it, and when the auctioning started, here they'd go. What a sweet sound. They had worked their way around the whole place to find this backer. And when they got it done, they hope they got a good price. They head home. They can pay their taxes, helps out with bills to be paid, prepare for next year's crop on the farm, get a lot of stuff, processed for the family. And they could pay their bills down at the store, and their friends and their workers, especially all their workers that helped them in the field. This went around all around the community like that. And they buy the family shoes and clothes for next year. This is just part of it, just like killing a hog or whatever on the farm. That's the way it was. Now, this is the way of life. It still goes on like that all around rural America. This is nothing different. These are just some old pictures of the way the old stuff used to do. It's all technical now. But this old country, it's seen some hard times, and I'm sure it's going to see some more too. Beautiful old country. This old machinery, this is a thing of the past. It's all modern now. But I can remember this growing up, and a lot of you can too. So I want to thank you for watching. I'm no expert, so God bless. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time.